stuff in Africa.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm glad to have my godfather back on with me. We haven't chatted in a couple years. We chatted last, I think, when he had his previous book, and he's put the last 4 years into a major project that we're going to do a little bit of explaining, a little bit of background to give you the context of this major work here. And we're going to talk all about it. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. We're going to give you the links and all that to where you can get this. This is definitely something that you're going to want to get, particularly as this topic is pretty hot, especially given the geopolitical climate, things going on in the West and the U.S., the fears of war and so forth. And so there's a lot of sensationalism around the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. And today we're going to be talking about it from the perspective of a very insightful, although Protestant commentator, James Jordan. Before I get to that, I'll just give a brief history of myself, and then we'll go to Dean, and we'll let him kind of give his background and exposition of this. When I was a Protestant Calvinist back in the day, I was very influenced by Jordan. In fact, one time I bought about a $300 crate of all of his works printed out. This was probably about 2004 or 5. And I still have some of those. In fact, I dug out one of my old Jordan texts here, which probably relates to what Dean has. Dean probably has this. This is Jordan's little booklet, Brief Reader's Guide to the Book of Revelation, which was a kind of a rare publication. But so for those that don't know, back in the 2000s, this is pre-Dean's conversion, but in the 2000s, there was a lot of people in the Calvinist Presbyterian world who were reading Jordan and Peter Leithart, and we're getting influenced by those exegetes and coming to a lot of new ideas that people, what they thought was new in regard to liturgical worship, in regard to biblical symbolism, covenant theology, and it was leading a lot of people into more Anglo-Catholic and Orthodox, and even sometimes Catholic in the Catholic direction. I myself kind of struggle with that, as many of you know, for many years, kind of between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, kind of back and forth. And then, thank God, ended up Orthodox, and Dean, of course, is my godfather. But James Jordan played a role in that for myself and for many people, and he is a very insightful commentator. He's a good exegete. I would say he's probably more almost like an Anglican, I guess we could say, in terms of his perspectives on things nowadays. But Dean had this great idea 4 years ago. I remember when he told me about this. I thought it was a great idea. It's a genius idea for a project, which was to get a hold of Jordan's lectures, which were thousands of pages, I believe, and then compact them into a 3-volume set. And that's what we have today, is Dean's 4-year project of all of the Jordan commentary on Revelation and Dean's notes and appendices. Dean, tell us the background of this book before we get into it in depth.
Okay. Well, I was a Protestant, and one day I read a book called Paradise Restored by a guy named David Chilton, and it was a great book. And it was the first time, yeah, there you go. It was the first time I'd ever encountered the whole idea of interpreting a lot of the end time stuff in the Bible into what was the end times for the people of the Bible, which was a couple of 3 decades later when the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed. And that view's technically called preterism or partial preterism. And it all just suddenly made sense. I was like, oh man, good gracious, this all comes together. And, if you know the Bible, if you've studied the Bible, it's like, wow, all these unanswered questions. Then Chilton has a big, thick commentary on Revelation called The Days of Vengeance. So then I read that. I read it again, read it again, read it again. Here you go. And then I became Orthodox. So this was all happening in the late 80s and 90s. And then I became Orthodox in 2001. And Chilton had he references Schmemann and Meyendorff and a lot of the church fathers, and is really into a whole liturgical setting. And there's actually rumors that when he died at the young age of 45, that a year or so before he had become Orthodox. Those rumors are hard to confirm. Anyway, every time I came across something cool in Chilton's stuff. The footnote was by a guy named James Jordan. I was like, I got to figure out who this James Jordan guy is. And so I started trying to find everything I could. At that point, his works were unpublished. I ordered something kind of like you. It was like this big, thick, like spiral bound notebook on his. He has a commentary in the Book of Judges. That was his first commentary. He's got about 20 commentaries now.
Yeah, I read the Judges back in the day, and it was great.
Yeah, great stuff. And then I came across a website a few years later called Word MP3 that has like a couple thousand or something lectures or podcasts by Jordan. So I started listening to him, thousands of hours. And I read it, and he had 204 lectures on Revelation that I listened to probably 3 or 4 times. And anyway, so I'm about, and he also, like Chilton, has very much of an Orthodox kind of affinity. Probably would have become Orthodox if he hadn't gotten so established at that point in his life. It's hard later. But at one point, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was like, you know what? I want to write a commentary on Revelation. Darn it. I've read all these other guys, and I think I could write a good one. And so started thinking about it and started working on it. Went down to Dallas, where Jordan lives. He had a stroke about 7 or 8 years ago, and he's pretty much incapacitated in terms of being able to do anything. He's still alive. You can have a conversation with him, but the conversation we would have in 30 seconds would take about 10 minutes or even 20 minutes, So he couldn't take his 204 lectures and turn them into a book. So I went down there knowing that I'd have to quote from him extensively because I loved his work so much, and I have to get that legal permission. And I went down there, spent a couple of days with him, smoked cigars, drank some scotch, a couple places, had a good time, got to know his son who kind of runs his estate. And all that led to a relationship to where I was able to get legal permission to quote from him extensively. Well, when I got into the project, I just realized, you know what? I'd love to make it my commentary, but he was so good that was dumb. So I just decided I was going to produce in book form Jordan's commentary, which I think was a good choice. Now, I write several appendices. I've got one long appendices on preterism and the date of Revelation. That's very good. I've got some prefaces. I got a lot of footnotes. I take there you go. Thank you. Yeah, on preterism and the date of Revelation. I took 7,000 pages of lectures and boiled it down to 1,000. So you're really getting, in many ways, my version of Revelation or my version of Jordan's version of Revelation. Right. So it's not without my imprint, but I did have to sort of defer to him because I do think he's a brilliant genius of a man who has incredible insights into symbolism, who knows the Old Testament scriptures just inside and out, and can bring all that into the book of Revelation, which is a capstone of all of scripture, just a glorious bringing together of everything. And so I was able to do that. And so that's the choice they ended up making. And after all that work and everything, this came out, in the last month or two.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I've been looking through it since I got these from you a few days ago, and we'll talk about some of the controversial issues and, but he's not Orthodox, and that's why we've got Dean here to kind of add footnotes and commentary, and Dean I noticed a small appendix about Jordan and Orthodoxy is there. First thing I would say about that criticism or objection, because I know people are going to say that, is look, if you go back to the Church Fathers, St. Basil said that it was very necessary to be educated and to be aware of other positions, even with pagan education. And so he exhorted young men to get, classical pedagogy down. We know that Basil and the Cappadocians, for example, relied heavily on Origen, even though Origen was eventually a heretic, rejected many times over. And also, St. Augustine was known to utilize the commentaries of the famous Donatus Tycho, I believe his name was, and use them extensively and talk very highly of them. So the fact that somebody is in schism or is in some other position does not mean they can't, as you put it in your book, I think you said something about thoughtful men from every walk of life can definitely give us insights. And again, I think people that read Jordan extensively realize that he is really good with symbolism. I remember the book that really opened my eyes was Through New Eyes. Jordan's book on hermeneutics. I read that back when I think I was a Protestant when I read that. And that one was a big one for linking together, biblical symbology, even biblical metaphysics and the structure of the universe connected to the structure of the temple. And so, that was a very formative text for me. Like you said, the book of Judges by Jordan was great. I still reference that commentary. Creation in 6 Days by Jordan is a classic. Primeval Saints by James Jordan is a classic. So there's so many excellent texts out there. And like you, I actually listened to about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 of the Revelation lectures back in the day, but it was just so vast that I just I didn't
Right.
spend a whole lot of time. But the other thing about James Jordan that in my life was very memorable was that he was the one that convinced me when I was a Calvinist of Paedo Communion. And I still have his Paedo Communion book, and that was a huge step on the way to Orthodoxy, even though I didn't know it at the time. Once you kind of go down the road and you realize that, well, really the only church that's maintained that tradition of Paedo Communion consistently is the Orthodox Church. The Roman Church, yeah, okay, they allow it with the Uniates, but that doesn't explain why they banned it when it used to be the Western practice. And so, again, a lot of nods and a lot of pros to the writings of Jordan. And I think the big step that he introduces for most Protestants on the journey is the importance of liturgy, and that the book of Revelation is a liturgical text. Like you said, you really cannot understand the book of Revelation, and we're not purporting to understand it in toto. We're purporting to have a better maybe approach to it than a lot of the more sensationalists, especially. This is far superior, obviously, to the dispensationalist premillennial approaches, which, of course, to the Orthodox world are heterodox. You cannot be premillennial in regards to the kingdom, given the fact that the Second Ecumenical Council specifies in the Creed that his kingdom shall have no end. That excludes any form of millenarianism or premillennialism in some literalist sense. So let's get into the text now that we've kind of cleared the way of this. You went about this in a unique way. Before we get to the partial preterist issue, which is obviously going to be a huge topic to kind of mention at the outset, one thing you did was you began at Revelation 12. Why did you do that, or what made you choose that? And then volumes 2 and 3 kind of pick up in other places.
Okay, great. Yeah. Volume 1 starts with Revelation 12 through 14. Which is a woman in the sky and a dragon comes and tries to devour her and all this kind of drama. Volume 2 is Revelation 1 through 11, which is obviously the first half of the book, and we can talk more about that. And Volume 3 is Revelation 15 through 22, which is the kind of the climax of the book with this great harlot who gets burned up and all that kind of stuff. Jordan maintains, and it rings true for me, that all 3 of those are the same historical territory. They're generally dealing with like AD 60, 60s, up through AD 70, the climax. So yeah, those are the 3 things. I wrote this, or I did this project. We're going to talk about preterism and dating Revelation before AD 70, which helps with the whole thing. And that's all something to talk about. But that wasn't really my primary motivation. My primary motivation to do this project was I love the Bible and I love the book of Revelation, because the book of Revelation is the culmination, the bringing together of all the scriptures. It's a glorious book. And Jordan does such a wonderful job with that. He does a wonderful job with all his commentaries. He's very insightful with these insights. And I wanted to bring that to others so they could enjoy it as well. And so I'm not going to start with, okay, Preface 1, why is it before AD 70? Preface 2, what is preterism? Preface 3, this, that, and the other. I just wanted to get right into the text. And so you got this woman who appears in the sky in Revelation 12. Who is she? It has to. There's a lot of stuff that has to do with like constellations. Like she's representing the constellation Virgo, and the constellation Draco is the dragon who appears next. And the end of the section has the 7 bowls, which kind of represent the 7 planets, the 7 moving stars in the sky, and all this sky symbolism, which Jordan spends a lot of time talking about how the Gentiles, that's how they knew about God before scriptures, before the New Testament. The Gentiles studied the stars. That's why we had the 3 magi and all that kind of stuff. And so he gets into all that stuff. And so, right away, when you start reading the book, you start getting these cool insights, from the constellations and the woman and the dragon. The dragon has 10 horns, and those 10 horns are not the 10 Caesars. That's the 10 horns on the sea beast that comes later. And those 10 horns are the 10 Caesars. We can talk about that. But the 10 horns on the dragon are the liturgical horns. In the Old Testament, you got the 4 horns on the bronze altar when you first come into the tabernacle or the temple. And then you got the 4 horns on the incense altar right before you get to the Ark of the Covenant. And then the Ark of the Covenant has 2 horns, which are the 2 cherubim up there that the high priest on the Day of Atonement sprinkles blood on. So they're horns as well. And so the dragon in the sky with these 10 horns is the false representation of the true liturgical 10-horned setup that God gave us in the scriptures. And there's a true one in heaven as well. We know that. So anyway, all that to say, I wanted to introduce all that cool stuff. And it's not till about page 100 in the first volume that I actually bring in Jordan's commentary on why this is all fulfilled mostly in the first century. It's not that Revelation doesn't also talk about the end times. It's multiple fulfillment. Prophecy in the Old Testament has double and tertiary fulfillment of things. So it can deal with the end times, but almost always when someone just takes Revelation and just starts talking about the end times, it's almost always bunk. It's just no good. And just to be honest with you, it's almost always a waste of time. I think I saw a tweet of yours, I think earlier today, which I really liked, which I think is relevant, where you were talking about how people need to get out there and make money and make a difference. And I think this end time speculation stuff is one of the distractions that is used to just keep people off the straight and narrow. Man, just go out there and live life and make a difference. It may be 100, 500, 1,000 years or more before Jesus comes back. So get out there and get something done, and don't get into this wild-eyed speculation. However, the book of Revelation can be extremely edifying for you if you focus on one of its fulfillments, one of its purposes, which is to show us how Jesus's prophecy that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed and the temple
was fulfilled.
all brings it all together. And we can spend a lot of time on that. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that's a great answer and really good points there. Yeah, I think the first thing that we want to mention is that I don't know about you, probably at some point, maybe not, but I definitely had, being raised Southern Baptist, a period where when I was 18, 19, 20, I remember going to the Christian bookstore when I first started getting interested in the Bible and reading it seriously. I remember reading some Tim LaHaye commentaries, and I read some of the standard kind of evangelical premillennial dispensationalist stuff. And at first I was really entranced by that. I really thought, John Hagee had some good points, and John Hagee and the beasts of the blood moon powers of Israel. And I followed Hagee. I even bought John Hagee's Prophecy Study Bible of all things. And I read through it, and then I started, inadvertently, I was getting into covenant theology and kind of harmonizing the Old and New Testament versus setting them off. And that indirectly would kind of lead me to eventually rejecting dispensationalism when you understand the unity of the covenants of the Old Testament into the New, and the sort of the consummation of the covenants into the New Covenant. And then I think I remember reading a book about amillennialism. I forget that author's name, but it's a very famous, well-known critique of premill by an Amil guy, Protestant guy. And then I read some texts from, that's around the time I started getting into Bonson and Gentry, and they had that text, House Divided, where they criticized premillennialism and dispensationalism. And so eventually I went, like you said, down that path of, I skipped amil. I was amillennial for maybe a year or two. And I kind of went pretty quickly into postmillennialism. And that leads you pretty quickly into the notion, as you said, preterism. I remember reading Chilton's little book, Great Tribulation. I still have my Dominion Press, Gary North copy. And then I remember Gary DeMar put out a bunch of books on preterism, and I read those. And then I remember they put out Destruction of Jerusalem by George Peter Holford, which is a pretty well-known partial preterist argumentation text. I'm only going through these to illustrate a point that there is a progression, I think, to this. And I know Dean's aware of all these, but probably a lot of the audience isn't. One of the first books that really, in an academic way, tried to argue for the 70 AD perspective from an inspiration view versus there's some liberal commentators who have the preterist, partial preterist view, but a lot of them see it as just something kind of cobbled together, and they don't necessarily affirm a view of inspiration, or that the Matthew 24, Luke 21, Olivet Discourse text and the book of Revelation are predicting the future. But that really undercuts, if it does predict the future, it undercuts one of the strong proofs of Jesus's ministry and prophetic power, was predicting the events of 70 AD and the destruction of the temple. So I read Before Jerusalem Fell by Dr. Ken Gentry, where he argues, I think, pretty forcefully for that. There's another really good book by a Methodist theologian and scholar from a long time ago. It's called Biblical Apocalyptics by Milton Terry, and he argued for a preterist dating as well. And then it became, I think, more and more accepted. We had, if you guys remember, when Scott Hahn converted to Catholicism, he wrote a very popular book called The Lamb's Supper. And the only reason I reference this is not to promote Catholicism at all, but Scott Hahn did make an interesting series of arguments in the book where the book of Revelation, as he presents it, is actually a present day application of the liturgical service that's going on in heaven. And that, when I read that totally reoriented my reading of the book of Revelation. I was able to then to understand, as you guys probably see me argue in a lot of the open forums and debates, chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-ish, that's John seeing into the heavenly liturgical worship that he's participating in at that time. And so it's a realized eschatology, which I think is the first kind of, important point that we want to mention here. One last point before I go back to you, Dean. Forgive me for rambling so long, but in the Orthodox tradition, many people may not know this. They may just not be aware of it. If you have, for example, Apostasy and Antichrist from Jordanville, this fairly popular monastery publication, on page 22, they do mention the importance of partial preterism and the 70 AD events as things that fulfill a lot of what's talked about in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. Not necessarily everything. So the book of Revelation does talk about things that occur at the end. We're not full preterism is heresy. It would be a kind of Gnosticism, a kind of Manichaeanism. So we're not advocating that, obviously.
That's where they think that Jesus has already returned, which is obviously heretical.
Everything happened in 70 AD according to these people. And so the end times have already come, resurrection's already happened, Antichrist is already gone. And, if you ask these people, so wait a minute, so evil and death continues on for all eternity? Yeah, sure. Well, that's a Manichaean position. That's Manichaean.
That's not worth addressing.
Exactly. So we're not going to talk much about that because it's outside the bounds of Orthodoxy. But last thing I'll say is that, this is important because, again, it is the traditional view of many, perhaps even most of the Eastern Church Fathers. Chrysostom very much stresses 70 AD. St. Athanasius, when he talks about Daniel 9 and the fulfillment of those passages, references 70 AD. Cyril of Alexandria references 70 AD as key and crucial for a lot of these passages. Origen does. And then I think Dean brought in some of the great, even the Orthodox Synaxarion, which I didn't even know that, talks about the dating. And so I'll let you mention what you want to talk about with regard to the dating issue first.
Oh, the dating issue. Well, first of all, most Protestant and Orthodox people today believe that Revelation was written in the 80-90s. And the reason they generally believe that is because one of the great church fathers, Irenaeus, has a paragraph that's we know about it because Eusebius, the church father, the Arian church father, puts it in one of his books, but we don't really get it from Irenaeus himself. But it's a passage that says that the revelation, or maybe it was John, was seen at the time of the Emperor Domitian, which is in the AD 90s. So because of Irenaeus's point there, several other church fathers kind of piggyback on that with Irenaeus as the source, and that's kind of become the accepted view. I don't think it's the correct view. I think I argue pretty well in my preface of my appendix on this that it's not the consensus view, and there's not a whole lot of talk about this in Orthodoxy in general. So there's not a whole lot of people who've written on it. Father Josiah Trenum has somewhat of a preterist view, and he says, quote, that there is no consensus on the date of revelation. But you've already mentioned some, Jay, the Lives of the Saints in the Orthodox Church on the day that John reposes says that he wrote Revelation in AD 67. So we obviously have one tradition in the Orthodox Church that it was written before AD 70. We have, there's no consensus, but I think it is fair game to consider viewing Revelation and much of the end times passages in the New Testament as being primarily fulfilled in AD 70 and with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And as you mentioned, this is a slam dunk, but John Chrysostom, Maximus the Confessor, and several others, they talk about Matthew 24 and the eschatological discourses being fulfilled in large part in AD 70. And they don't say it about the book of Revelation. That doesn't mean they didn't believe it. It was just we don't have that. Yeah, so there's a tradition there, and I could list all the specifics, but that's you gotta get the book. They're all in audiobook form too, by the way.
Oh, is that available at the site too? The link?
Well, you go to Amazon, yeah. Yeah, if you want to.
Well, I've got your website linked. Does that lead people to the audio?
If you click on that, it's going to get you to Amazon, and Amazon can get you the audio books. You can buy the books separately for cheaper. You can buy all three of them in that cool case box set from me for $60. Pretty good deal. But yeah, they're all audio book, and it's all there for you. But I think the case has been made. Now it's interesting. Here's a question. Why isn't there much commentary about it in the Orthodox Church? Well, there's a lot of things you could say. There's just a handful, 5 or 10 before AD, before 1000 AD, the schism. They're all real thin. None of them are very long.
I think you have there's Andrew of Caesarea, Hippolytus, Andrew, yeah.
Well, you got Andrew of Caesarea is the longest one, and it's not very long. He does have examples of preterist interpretations. So, although he leans primarily towards futuristic, but he doesn't think it's real future in his time. But anyway, the reason there's not a lot of commentary is one, it took a long time for the church to canonize Revelation, so there wasn't a lot of commentary because of that. And then it's just kind of sat there, and nobody wants to touch it, I guess. I have one theory that I can't corroborate, but I thought I'd run it by you. But I think one of the reasons we don't get a lot of preterist commentary in the first few centuries of the church is because everybody knew. It's like obvious. It's like,
yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear. I totally agree. When John writes the book of Revelation, it says these things are soon to come to pass. Right. So the internal immediate textual evidence suggests an immediate fulfillment of, again, not necessarily everything, but much of what's being written. And if you just think on a practical basis, like, what use would it be for John to write these mystical letters to the 7 churches, specifically of Asia Minor, to tell them these things are soon to come to pass, when it's something that's thousands of years into the future and basically has no relevance to the persecuted churches of that day?
That's one of the great things, is that the scripture is true. and he came soon. He is also coming, later. We don't know when. Let me give you an example that I think is very helpful that Jordan gives, and that is when Isaiah says the virgin will be with child. There's 3 fulfillments of that. We know the ultimate fulfillment is Jesus being born of the Virgin Mary. When Isaiah made that prophecy to the king, he himself had a son through his wife 2 years later. Now, because of textual stuff and everything, the word woman, a virgin shall bear a child, the woman shall bear a child, it can go either way. And as Jordan says, you can't actually get into rock solid virgin birth until the New Testament, which is very clear. We all believe in a virgin birth. But back when Isaiah prophesied it, it could go either way. And the woman did bear a child in 2 years, his son.
Right.
And then about 2 or 3 decades later, that same passage, there's a couple of conflicts in Israel. A couple of armies come in and take over and do some things. It's a fulfillment of that prophecy. Jordan calls that the midterm prophecy and the ultimate prophecy. You got the near prophecy fulfillment. You got the mid prophecy fulfillment. And you got the ultimate prophecy fulfillment. Well, we have the same thing here with Revelation and the eschatological discourses.
Well said.
And you've got near fulfillment in AD 70, and these are things that kind of like Isaiah having a kid in 2 years. Everybody could kind of see that and figure it out. But back in Isaiah's day, when Isaiah says the virgin shall bear a child, and we will call him Emmanuel, God with us. What did they know about in several centuries? This guy was going to be born in Nazareth outside of Israel and was going to become the Messiah. They just didn't know anything about that. And I think in some ways we can say our using Revelation as end time speculation is kind of like being like them. Like they didn't know what that was going to be. We don't know what this ultimate fulfillment of Revelation is going to be like, but we can deal with the early stuff, and the early stuff is really good.
Exactly. The early stuff, you really only understand the book of Revelation. This is something I learned from James Jordan over the years, having read him since, basically 2002 or 3. It's like 21 years of reading James Jordan, is that he makes the point that the book of Revelation, you have to know the Torah inside and out. You have to know the major and minor prophets. Those are big, big, big keys to understanding, because so much of the imagery and the language is out of Leviticus, it's out of Ezekiel.
Yeah, Leviticus, Exodus, all those
Zechariah,
Deuteronomy, all those arcane books become a real big deal. Let me mention one other thing while we're at it. I've already mentioned how important it is that we not get distracted. Like you said, go out there and make some money and make a difference and change the world and all those kind of things. And so having a preterist mindset for Revelation is very helpful for that. But the other thing it does, amongst many things, it really orients us, and it's so relevant to today. Jesus defeated the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus came and fulfilled everything. Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel.
Right.
And Jesus predicted, because of their rejection of him, he predicted that they would be destroyed in AD 70. Well, that's not a very popular view right now, as you can imagine, but it's very important for us. Jesus came and conquered. Jesus came and he fulfilled everything. And what happened in his lifetime and afterwards is so significant for all of history. And so this view of end times passages, including Revelation, is so helpful in our understanding of how things really are.
Yeah, it really, again, is an end to any of the dispensationalist Judaizing heresy. That error revolves around precisely the point of not understanding, number one, the continuity between the Old and the New Testament, and number two, misinterpreting the passages that liberal higher critical scholarship has for a long time said disproves the New Testament. What do I mean? Well, the passages where Jesus says, for example, in Luke 21 and Matthew 24, that the things that he talks about are coming upon this generation, meaning the people standing in front of him. He says, you will see these events. You will see Jerusalem razed by the Roman armies. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by enemies, know that its desolation is near. That's a reference to the desolation in the book of Daniel. Liberal scholars said if this is talking about the second coming, as most futurists think, then Jesus didn't come back in 70 AD, and the Bible's false, and Jesus is a false Messiah. He was an apocalyptic, wandering, loon preacher who said it was the end of the world, and so we know his message isn't true. So this is why it's so crucial to understand, no, he did come back in judgment, as he said he would, and he gave
coming in the clouds.
Yeah, that's mentioned in Ezekiel. It's mentioned in Isaiah as a coming of judgment.
Several places in the Old Testament.
Right, it's a coming of judgment. Yeah,
judgment. He did it again in AD 70. Another thing that's important is that the glorious city, the bride of Christ, which is the last several chapters of Revelation, is talking about the church, and so this view gives
it's
all
the
this
church
glory.
now. That's the key. It's the church now.
Yes, our church. The Orthodox Church, our church, is the glorious manifestation of what Jesus did. He brought together and built his church, and it turned into this glorious bride city. It's continuing to be a glorious bride city until the ultimate fulfillment. But it really energizes you if you're Orthodox and you're excited about the church. When I was growing up, my dad was a pastor, Bible teacher, pastor, and all that kind of stuff. But until I became Orthodox at age 35 or 40, I hated the institutional church. My dad hated the institutional church. Protestants kind of hate the institutional church, I think, generally. But suddenly, when you become Orthodox, it's like, oh, I love the church. I love the phrase institutional church now. It's a glorious thing, and it really is the bride of Christ, and it's the glorious city. So that's another reason why this is an important view.
It also, again, vindicates this point that we've been making so often, especially with my friend Lewis's documentary on Christian worship in the Old Testament, is that the book of Revelation is a liturgical book. It's a book that's showing the liturgical warfare that's released via the worship of the church. In other words, when the liturgy is happening, and that's happening, the divine liturgy on earth, that's the same liturgy as the liturgy in heaven in a mystical, unitive way. That's why it's an already, not yet, and not a all future end times thing. The biggest error of American Christianity is this futurist end times idea that all those promises that were made by the prophets, that when the Messiah comes, this and this and this will happen, the nations will convert. Everybody thinks that's at the end of the world. It's not the end of the world, and the easiest way to disprove all that dispensationalist, premillennialist error is to point out that every time the New Testament cites Psalm 110, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, that is not talking about the end times. Every time it's cited in the New Testament, it's about the ascension. Guys, the ascension happened back in the first century. It's not talking about the second coming. But every Protestant, every dispensationalist, evangelical, for the most part, except for the Bonson gentry, which is minuscule amongst Protestants, they assume that all of this is talking about a future end times thing. And even people now, there's a lot of people on the internet getting interested in the book of Revelation, getting interested, are we going to the mark of the beast? Is the passport this and that, stabby, end of the world? They're all still thinking that, well, all the book of Revelation is talking about everything that's happening in the world. Now, it may be still applicable when that end of the world happens but we don't know when the end of the world is, and we're not told that.
And I'll just point out as a caveat that I do believe we have a great reckoning in store for us. I mean, you just read the tea leaves, nuclear holocaust and, the pandemics and all this kind of stuff. I do think our wicked world probably could use a cleansing. And I think we probably will see a great reckoning in the next couple of decades. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the world. And that doesn't mean Jesus is coming back. We need to dig in and keep going.
One last couple points here on the dating of the book. Again, and I'm not trying to distract from Dean's book. Dean's trilogy is absolutely necessary. But for those who are just specifically obsessed with the dating issue, and if you're looking for something that's very academic, Gentry's book is really good. And he begins by talking about the two early pieces of evidence. You might think there's a lot. There's actually not that much early evidence for what you would assume is a post 70 AD dating. It's really only Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus, and like Dean said, this is Irenaeus via Eusebius. which may or may not be, reliable. And again, we don't follow any single church father on an issue. That's the Roman Catholic view, right? They follow one guy, the Pope, or Aquinas or Augustine on this or that issue. So we're much more of a synodal, mind of the church. And if the church wasn't unified on this, it's very important. Why was it not unified? Because there's not an inclusion of the book of Revelation that's normative in the big patriarchal sees until Athanasius goes to Rome and convinces the Roman see that the book of Revelation is authentic and should be included. It was doubted in many, many giant patriarchal sees throughout the empire for many centuries. And in the Orthodox Church, there's not a canon in that kind of fixed sense, in a loose fixed sense, until Trullo and until the 6th and 7th Council. So it's very late. And that would mean that the church is functioning perfectly well without a Protestant list of books or a specified sola scriptura canon. That means they're working on tradition, they're working on the oral teaching, they're working on what text they may or may not have at that time. And that is another reason why the book of Revelation is not dealt with a whole lot in the first few centuries. And also, as Dean pointed out, there's actual, extra textual evidence for early date as well that's often ignored or not looked at. One last thing I would add is that in terms of dating, it's also, there's a commentary by Mounts, and nowadays a lot of scholars, both liberal and believing, they'll talk about the preterist interpretation. So this is no longer something that's even seen as kind of outlandish. This is a very famous commentary series by evangelical scholars of different flavors. And Mounts has a whole section, pages 19, 20, 21, 22, about preterism and the dating of the book of Revelation. So it's not outlandish or unheard of. And first question, though, before we get into your book again, Dean, is, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot or get you in trouble, but there was a Lightheart commentary that came out, this 2-volume series by Lightheart, but you made some really good points to me as to why it's not that, it's a little too maybe technical, and your commentary brings in the Orthodox vantage point, which is why I think it's going to be superior. What does your presentation with Jordan offer, contrasted to the Lightheart dual set there?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm friends with Peter Lightheart, and he's a great guy. And without his connections, I wouldn't have been able to pull off this project. So he deserves credit for that. His commentary, 2 volumes, is very technical, and a bit, I would say, a bit arcane. And he does not have the communication skills of James Jordan. There's a couple other commentaries. Of course, we've already talked about David Chilton's commentary. Great commentary, great communicator. However, he has the problem. He gets too political, and he goes on. He too quickly goes on some kind of rant, which is always instructive because his rants, many of his rants, are moot today. But that would be the weakness in his commentary. He also has some interpretive issues that I think are inferior to what Jordan brings to the table. I haven't read Ken Gentry's commentary. I'm sure it's good because he's so solid. It probably doesn't have the communication ability that Jordan has. Very few do. So there's very little that's been written from a preterist perspective. So I would say communication ability for 1, insights into the scriptures 2, which is what Jordan brings, and which was my main motivation. I didn't write this to do an argumentation for preterism and an early date. I've got all that in there because it's important. It's ancillary, and you got to do it. I did it because of the cool insights. So I think that's what it brings to the table. But yes, I do bring in the Orthodox perspective, Jordan and Orthodoxy, the Orthodox perspective on early dating and preterism. All those things are there. So that's completely unique. And as Jay and I were talking the other day, you know, neither of us just believe that Protestantism has a future. So 50 years from now, what I've done here, I think is going to have a lot of relevance, but I don't think Protestant perspectives will.
One last note on other books and works that are out there. Did you ever see this one? I think one of the four here is one of the four in this is preterist. It's 4 views on the Book of Revelation, and one of them is preterist.
I got that.
Did you find that one to be useful at all, or was it not that great?
No, is a Verkey one of those?
No. This is a Protestant evangelical publication that has 4 views. Okay. I don't remember who the. In other words, do you remember the 4 views series where it'd be like 4 arguments, like
right?
So, but I don't remember who. So there's a futurist, there's an historicist, preterist, but I don't remember who does the preterist one.
I should also mention, because some people have a lot of acumen in this area. There are these days, I guess there's probably 5 or 6 Orthodox commentaries out there on Revelation. I find them not very helpful because they basically have what you would call a symbology view, I guess you call it, where they take something and they say, well, here's the symbolic kind of overarching view, and so since beasts symbolically represent giant evil empires, then when Antichrist comes, he'll be over some giant evil empire. We don't know what that is, but that's the kind of commentary you get, and that's fine. It's just not helpful. It's not helpful because, first of all, they're talking mostly about the future, and they really need to talk about the near fulfillment to get something that's kind of solid. So I just don't, it's okay. But there's one by Archbishop of Verkey, which is kind of small, which does that, and that's fine. And then there's a 7-volume one by I forget his name, Militidios. But a lot of people like that one because they get excited because there's a 7-volume commentary by an Orthodox guy. But if you read it, it's just kind of generic and it doesn't do much for you. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think the thing is that you need the insights that the Orthodox liturgy has for the Book of Revelation. Believe it or not, I think that's a key point. I mean, again, I haven't gone into the Jordan text because you just put this out, but
by the way, this is just for your listeners. Some of the specifics on that. Revelation 4 is the throne room, and then the Lamb comes and he opens the book and he unseals it. It's very much like the liturgy where you bring out the gospel book and you unseal the gospel book, and then you read the gospel and preach, which Jordan says is the trumpets. That's the blasting of the message.
Yeah, that's exactly And in fact, Scott Hahn.
And then the last part of the book is the bowls being poured out, which is the Eucharist. And so, Orthodox view of liturgy.
Dean, are you there? Can you pause that? Are you there? Your internet is freezing up there, Dean. Last thing we heard you say was Orthodox view of the liturgy, and you were talking about the bowls. So whatever you're saying, pause it. Yeah, Dean got raptured. We're gonna wait for Dean to come back here. His internet will be back in just a second. What I noticed is that, even Scott Hahn in Lamb's Supper, which is, this Scott Hahn obviously went in the direction of Roman Catholicism, but the liturgical points in this book by Hahn are actually still correct and accurate. And he's actually making this point that Dean's making. He may have even gotten it from James Jordan, that the seals being opened and the bowls, etc. This is liturgical spiritual warfare that's going on. That's the argument that I found very convincing back when I read Lamb's Supper. I actually read this, look at this, in 2002. You can see where I signed my Scott Hahn Lamb's Supper. And he relies a lot on the 70 AD events and the coming of the kingdom of heaven, the New Jerusalem, to earth to be the liturgical worship of the church. Now, if you think about it, for the church to be the New Jerusalem, the spiritual Jerusalem, etc., the kingdom of heaven on earth, then it only makes sense for the old system to be rolled up like a scroll, as the book of Hebrews says, and taken away, right? And that's exactly what we see going on here. Okay, now Dean's back. Dean, you were saying there when you cut out that the bowl judgments and the pouring out and all that, this is kind of liturgical spiritual warfare. Well, he popped out again. So, yeah, there's something to that. And I would add, too, not many people know this. Let me see if I can actually find this. Let me pull this book off. Just one second here. Well, I was looking for my Roman Missal because my Roman liturgical text, it actually has some commentary that's preterist in it, which kind of blew me away I remember when I first found that. I can't find it. I got a whole shelf over here of like liturgical stuff, and my old Latin Mass Missal used to be over there, but there's a note in there about the dating of the book of Revelation and well, actually, technically, it's about the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse. And for those that don't know, there's a pattern where Luke 21 and Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, roughly matches up to the pattern of the events in the book of Revelation. Hence, we know that they're pretty much probably talking about the same events, right? That's another key, I think, to understanding the book of Revelation. Dean, are you back? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you. I'm good.
Okay, so yeah, the last thing you said was you were talking about the bowl judgments, and you were talking about how this is kind of liturgical spiritual warfare.
Right. Yeah, and that's Jordan touches on that some. It's not the main focus. I think the main focus is the decade of the 80s, 70s, and how those events correspond with what's going on. He says that the premise of Revelation, it starts with a revelation of the glorious bridegroom, Jesus Christ, who throughout the book gathers together his church and turns it into a glorious bride. But in chapters 2 and 3, he addresses the seven churches. And Jordan says that the whole premise of the book is that Jesus comes to the seven churches and he says, okay, I'm about to come to you in judgment and look at your good and bad. And as an object lesson for you to know that I'm serious about what I'm talking about, look and see what I'm going to do to the Old Testament church. I'm about to destroy the Old Testament church. I'm not playing around. I'm for real. So he says that's the whole premise of the book, but he says it's also a warning to us, because he says number seven is a symbolic number. And so the seven churches really represent the church for all time. And so it's true for all of us that Jesus is coming to us at some point. And let's not forget what he did to the Old Testament church, which was his bride that he loved so much. When they went apostate, it was done. He destroyed them. Not one stone was left on another.
Exactly.
And so that's the warning for us. And he says, look, Jesus is coming to you if you die of a heart attack in the next few seconds. Jesus is coming to you in the Eucharist on Sunday. Jesus is coming to you in your culture, because your culture, if it's wicked, needs to be judged. So that's the ultimate message of Revelation.
Yeah, exactly. In
But
fact,
its first fulfillment. Its first fulfillment is AD 70, and what happened to Israel and the events of the AD 60s.
yeah, one of the insights I remember from the Chilton book was when I read that, and I like you, I read it through, I think, a couple times, and I noticed that, oh, this covenant relationship is, there's covenant blessings and cursings, and those covenant blessings and cursings that we read about in Deuteronomy, that's really the same principle that Jesus is outlining when he talks to the seven churches. He says, you've been faithful here, however, I have this against you, do this and this, or else this will happen. That's the covenant stipulations, exactly like you read about in Deuteronomy to Israel. If you do this, you're blessed. If you don't, chastisement will come. And so the bill of divorce that's mentioned in Hosea and the minor prophets is precisely, and I think Isaiah too, is precisely what's being given out there in the book of Revelation. It is the covenantal divorce from that bride and the new bride that is the spotless virgin bride, the church. That's a huge key to the book of Revelation. And that's why, another reason why we can't have this sort of dispensationalist premillennialist idea.
Yeah, and the book climaxes in chapter 17 with the great whore of Babylon, which is incredibly sensational stuff. And she ends up getting burned up with fire because she's a priest's daughter. Jerusalem is the daughter of God. She's a priest's daughter, and so she gets burned.
Yeah, that's what Leviticus is, as the penalty.
Yeah, exactly. That's the penalty of all that. But anyway, it's all very exciting stuff. But this harlot gets rejected as God's woman, and he brings in the new woman. And so there's a lot of I modeled each volume. I modeled after a genre of movie making, and the third volume was the hardest for me. But it was modeled after Harlot and Bride. It was modeled after a romance. I don't know if it's romantic comedy, but you got a guy and two girls, and he
which one? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, he has to choose one or the other, and it was funny because when I was trying to look for a comedy to base it off of, or a romance to base it off of, almost all of them now are a girl choosing two guys, not a guy choosing two girls.
Exactly. Now, so what
the first volume is based on an action adventure story. You got a dragon chasing this woman trying to devour her, and the second volume was a little tricky, but it's interesting. But it's based on the mentor genre. Think of a Karate Kid, where you got this mentor, teaching this kid how whatever. And the first half of Revelation is all about Christ is trying to teach John how to go out there and fight the good fight. And John's just like falling down on the dust, and he can't do anything. And he finally gets in chapter 10, this angel who is Christ comes down and basically has him eat this book, which is very Eucharistic. And the book is also thunders. And John, who was called a son of thunder back in the day, now he's just a wuss laying down on the ground and he can't get up. But the Eucharist book kind of revives him. And chapter 11 is the two witnesses, and he's sort of represented in the two witnesses. And they go out with fire in their mouths like lions, and they go out and they do this great work. So 1 through 11 is kind of based on the mentor genre.
Yeah, that was interesting.
By the way,
I was about to ask you what movies were the other two, what genre were the other two on? So that's exactly
any action adventure movie is pretty easy. I don't know which one I particularly thought of, but the romance one, actually, I had to go to what's the name of that Bill Murray movie?
Caddyshack.
No, it's an early Bill Murray movie where he's oh, come on now. He's got a girlfriend who ends up killing herself. It's a serious movie, Bill Murray movie.
I'm thinking of old, like Stripes, Caddyshack. I mean, I don't. No. When I think of Bill Murray, I think of 80s.
Are you getting people? Are people messaging you in the chat?
Let me look.
Somebody will come up with it.
They're all saying the ones I said, Stripes, which is definitely not it. What about Bob? No, that's comedy.
no. Anyway, we'll come up with it in a minute. Anyway, he has two women in his life. They're both sisters, and the one seems wonderful, but in the beginning of the movie, she's running a kissing booth, so she really at heart is kind of a whore, but she's a prim and proper, and she's really about money. And
is it called Razor's Edge?
Razor's Edge.
Okay, I've never seen that. People are talking about it in the chat. Yeah,
and the sister is more, down to earth and not really whatever. But she, because of hard times, she becomes a prostitute. Bill Murray gets her out of prostitution, and they're finally happy. And then the sister does some stuff to make the other sister despondent, and she goes and kills herself. But anyway, the point being that it's a movie where a guy has to choose between two women, and that's the one I used. By the way, one of the things I want to mention to you is that one of Jordan's of his many interpretations that really help to interpret the Book of Revelation is that in symbolism, biblical symbolism, killing is often salvation. So just like Paul says, you mortify the flesh, or we have to die to Christ or whatever. So like in Revelation 9, you got this army of like locusts, with scorpion tails. And then suddenly another army emerges, which is heads of lions that breathe fire and this, that, and the other. Well, the second army is a righteous army. And this army comes and it breathes fire and it kills all these people, kills 1/3 or 1/4 or whatever. And Jordan says this represents salvation. And so there's several places, there's a lot of armies and killing in Revelation. And in several of the places, the way to interpret it is a righteous army coming and killing people and bringing them into salvation.
Yeah.
And it really helps to interpret the book.
Yeah, I remember, ruling with a rod of iron, the word that proceeds from his mouth, etc. That's essentially the preaching of the gospel, this kind of stuff, and it's all pictured as warfare going on. And also, we can't miss. I don't know if Jordan goes in this direction. I assume he probably would, but there's a lot of mention of angels in the Book of Revelation and the participation of the angels and the saints in this spiritual warfare. Does that come up?
It's a major theme, and it's the major theme of Volume 1, Revelation 1 through 11. But one of the ways you can interpret Revelation as the major theme is that angels are replaced by men, humans, as rulers of the universe. So you got chapter 4, you got this throne room, you got these 4 living creatures, which are angels. You got these 24 elders, which I believe are angels, archangels, and Jordan makes a good argument for that. You got all these angels everywhere in the throne room. And then suddenly this man appears. He's called a lamb at first, but as the book goes on, he's more the son of man. And the lamb is the first fruit. Just like in the Old Testament, you'd have a sheaf or a first fruit. And then he brings up a couple of loaves in the Old Testament. And Jordan talks about that as being kind of what happens at Pentecost and some of the early first fruits of the early church. Then he brings in the whole 12 loaves, which is the entire church before AD 70. But the point of all this is that, Paul says we're going to judge angels. And in the garden, we had an angel who was supposed to instruct us who went bad. And because Adam sold out.
Yeah. And we have to replace the 1/3 that fell.
Well, yes. And then and the other 2/3 we are over. We were created to rule over the cosmos.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's a preliminary time where where angels are our guardians, like governesses or babysitters or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we finally grow up, and now we're in charge of everything. And that's a major theme in Revelation.
Yeah.
And it's very insightful. And you'll see that in the book of Revelation, you have all these angels everywhere for the first 11, 12, 13 chapters. And then the last few chapters, there's no angels anywhere. Yeah. It's all people.
Interesting.
Hosts of people all in the heavens and in the bride of Christ and in the heavenly city and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, another good point, too, that I noticed from one of the reasons Jordan's really good and worth looking at for this material is that Jordan approaches the texts from a literary perspective, and and I don't mean like the literature professor at the local university, but a believing literary perspective. And that's very important because textual scholars, for example, a lot of times, especially if they're unbelieving, they're not approaching the text, number one, with the presupposition of belief and inspiration. And number two, they're not approaching the text with the idea that there's a coherent, holistic interpretation. Think about it. If the Bible is coherent and meaningful from Genesis through Leviticus into Ezekiel and Zechariah and then into the book of Revelation, then you're going to have a much better insight into those passages and making sense of the text from the holistic perspective than if you don't believe in inspiration and you treat this as some sort of dry technical manual, as many textual scholars do, with the presupposition of unbelief. They're going to be barred and blinded from understanding a lot of the meaning of the passages because they don't have the presupposition of belief and that the Bible is a coherent, holistic narrative.
Yeah, he has a funny offhand line where he says one of the problems we have with biblical interpretations is most of the exegetes are attorneys,
yes,
and accountants, and
exactly,
and engineers. And he says we need more literary people.
Yes, the Bible's not written by textual scholars. It's written by people who are basically, except for some occasion, right? Proverbs is not really stories. Psalms is liturgical, but also kind of has some story elements in it.
So for example,
the stories.
What you're talking about, wine. Wine first appears in the Bible, I guess, with Noah and whatever. But it's I'm sure I could come up with it. Well, here's a better example. The bird that comes back to Noah to tell him that there's going to be land has an olive twig.
Right.
And then when Moses builds the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies is built all out of olive wood. And then when we get to the New Testament, everything that Jesus is doing in the last week or so is in the Mount of Olives. He's crucified on the Mount of Olives. He's buried on the Mount of Olives. He ascends from the Mount of Olives. And so, an unbelieving person who had literary insights would say, oh, this is all very interesting, but of course, whatever. But a believing one like Jordan says, no, the Holy Spirit crafted all of this together, and it's all by design. And so we can take these incredible themes and build on them. That's one of many examples.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's basically pattern recognition at a literary level that does help you. And I don't mean to degrade this into some corny, this is not Bible code stuff. That's, scammery, gematria stuff. This is actual like literary patterns that you notice. And if you attend the liturgy a lot in the Orthodox Church, you'll begin to notice that the way the liturgical structure of the church patterns and reads the text is very much in this symbolic, overarching meta narrative that makes the Bible and the whole story of the church and Christ cohesive and coherent. I mean, again, this is kind of basic, but it's absolutely necessary. We've got a couple super chats here before we keep going. Ted Nublet, $5. Forgive me for derailing. What's the Orthodox position on the tearing of the veil in the temple? As a Protestant, I took this to mean that we don't need any church fathers, or that we can go directly to God with our prayers and concerns. What video should I watch? Well, the first video I would say to watch is the video that we made, mini documentary, addressing that very topic, which is what exactly carries over from the Old Testament to the New Testament in terms of the decision of the apostles having that authority from Christ to make that choice. And what do we see in the early church? And in fact, you'll notice in the New Testament itself, Nublet, we find in the book of Revelation, altar, incense, we find vestments, we find saints, liturgical worship, angels, imagery, all of that, particularly in Revelation 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, when John sees all this stuff going on as a liturgical worship service. So that becomes a new proof text in the Protestant sense for where we get this stuff. And it's not just arbitrary. Now, specifically, and I'll let Dean answer if he wants to, in regard to the veil in the temple is rent. In other words, you getting access to the heavenly worship in the divine liturgy and eating the Eucharist is the rending of the veil. And because Hebrews says the veil is his flesh. So yeah, the temple veil is rent, but you actually participating in the eating of the Eucharist and his flesh is you piercing the veil. So it doesn't mean there is absolutely no veil, and it doesn't mean that you don't go directly to God, but you go directly to God through the means that God appointed, namely the church.
Oh yeah, that's good. I would also add, Jordan talks about this in the commentary, but the Mount of Olives actually is a little bit above where the temple stood. And so when Jesus was being crucified and the Roman centurion sees the veil ripped in two, they had a perfect view of it. But the symbolism of the height there shows that what I was talking about before, that the centrality of God and his temple and his presence moves from the temple up to the Mount of Olives, which is open. And you've got Christ and his life and his whole thing and his people that he's commissioned. And so now the temple, or the presence of God, becomes Jesus and his people, which is everywhere, not just the temple. So the ark is broken. One of the things, in Revelation, you've got a couple of places where the ark is opened up, and there's a lot of things that happen. This woman comes out of it, and there's a lot of stuff. But that theme starts in Revelation 6, where there's all these saints under the altar, and they're crying out, "How long, O Lord?" And then we see them in the next chapter. They get sealed. 144,000 get sealed on their foreheads. And then we see them again in chapter 14, I think, where they're standing on Mount Zion with the Lamb, the 144,000. So they keep moving from under to on the earth to almost to heaven, because they're on top of Mount Zion. And then in chapter 15, we see them standing on the sea of glass in heaven. So they're in heaven now, but they're not in the temple yet. And then the temple, everybody leaves the temple. All the angels leave the temple. And then the saints, the 140,000, move into the temple. And then the temple turns into the city. So that's the gradual graduation of the saints into being actually the temple itself. And so the opening of the rending of the veil in the temple sort of is symbolic of all the saints kind of pouring out and filling up everything.
Yeah, and I mean, just this idea, this sort of very prevalent Protestant idea that the rending of the temple and the destruction of the temple means that there's no more liturgical worship or anything like that, is also refuted, not just from the New Testament. For example, Hebrews 13, Paul says very clearly in Hebrews 13, after talking about all of these Judaic elements that have been fulfilled, he says that we have an altar that we eat from, that those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat at. So in other words, there's still an altar. Most Protestant churches do not believe in a Eucharistic altar. Some do, in theory and in name, but to specifically address that question, we made a mini documentary that's called Christian Worship in the Old Testament over at the channel Orthodox Shahada. Here is the link right there in the chat that addresses that issue very specifically. Dave the Philippian sends $10 and he says, I just ordered Dean's box set. All y'all should do the same. Now, let me ask this question, Dean. One thing that people have criticized in Jordan for many, many years, and I want to get your take on it in terms of how you handle this, or what you did with maybe this wasn't there at all in your mind, but people have criticized Jordan for being overly kind of like creative with the text, and maybe it's not actually there and he's reading into it. Did you encounter any areas where you felt like Jordan was maybe going a little too far, was a little too speculative? Did you have to rein him in at any points, or did you feel like...
Absolutely. A lot.
Okay.
A lot. But, I will say this. I find him to be generally very sober and very solid.
Okay.
And, in my preface on Jordan or Orthodoxy or its appendix, I call him very Orthodox-ish. I mean, he just believes almost everything that the Orthodox believe. He should be Orthodox. He hates images, so that's sort of his fig leaf for not becoming Orthodox. But sure, does he go on some weird rants and go on some speculation here and there? Yeah, he does, but I don't think it's representative of his general character.
Yeah, that's good. Now we've talked about the 3 volumes, and is there anything you want to talk about in terms of like the final volume? Because we didn't really get to that. You were working your way up kind of to the end, and the the coming down of the city, and that we have the imagery of the tree of life and all of that. Were there any insights there towards the climax of the text that you felt were unique, or something that you never heard, or did he bring anything new to the table there?
Well, it's all about 2 women, and the first woman, which is the Old Testament woman, and then she goes bad. Um, now, if you have a preterist interpretation and you're Orthodox, you won't struggle with this probably, but the first woman, who's the harlot, is Israel. Israel and Jerusalem, and she goes from bad to worse to worse to worse until where she's actually drinking blood. So we have this description of the harlot in Revelation 17, where she has this golden cup in her hand full of abominations. Well, it says that she's drinking the blood of the saints. So, and that's an abomination in the Old Testament, drinking blood. But she's just this evil woman who's drinking the blood of the saints. And even that, the way I structure it, even that isn't the final nail in her coffin. The final nail in her coffin is, it says after that, it says that John looked at the harlot and he wondered and marveled. And you get to this point where you almost feel like this evil woman is trying to seduce John, who represents the church, and he's trying to seduce her into what she's doing. And it's that final seduction, or attempt at seduction, which is the final nail in her coffin. And so Christ, who is jealous of his virgin bride, comes, there you go, her cup of a filthy abominations. So that's when Christ comes in and destroys the harlot, and quote unquote has to make his choice. So we know God has all the things figured out from beginning, but in the drama of it, he destroys the harlot, and he gets the way God sets it up is he has the beast destroy the harlot. The beast is Rome, with 10 horns, which are the 10 Caesars, Julius Caesars, all the way up to Vespasian. And they're thick as thieves for a while, but suddenly they must have some kind of love-hate relationship. But suddenly the beast is sick of the harlot and says, "I'm going to go and destroy her." And Jordan talks about how Rome finally got just sick of Israel, which was constantly rebelling and constantly causing problems. So all that drama takes place in Revelation 17 and 18. There's another really cool part in that part of the book that's worth noting, and that is you get to this buying and selling stuff, which everybody loves to talk about for the end times.
Mark of the beast.
Unless you have the mark of the beast on your hand or your forehead. But Jordan makes a very compelling case that all that is not talking about actual financial transactions. It's talking about liturgical transactions. That having the beast on your forehead and hand is the same as having Yahweh on your forehead and
it's contrasted to the church.
Your whole being is dedicated and avowed to God in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament, the apostate beast wants everybody to be fully sworn to him, and so you can't make a liturgical transaction, i.e., you can't go to the temple and worship. Jesus says you're going to be kicked out of the temple. So the true Christians in the AD 50s and 60s couldn't go to the temple to worship because they were cast out, because they didn't have the mark of the beast on their forehead and on their hand. Now, when you look at the list in Revelation 18, it's fascinating because all these merchants lament that they can no longer sell their wares, their gold and their silver and their incense and their frankincense and their sheep and cattle and their purple and scarlet and linen. Well, that whole long list in Revelation 18 is almost verbatim the list in Exodus of the materials to be used to build the tabernacle. So the whole point of that passage is that this is talking about the temple. This is talking about liturgical transactions. This is talking about prayer. This is talking about you can't go to the temple. You're cast out of society. And then what's fascinating in the last 3 or 4 chapters of Revelation, which is all about the new city and the bride of Christ, those same items come up quite a bit for the new temple or the new bride.
Yeah, I've always felt like there's an insight here, and you may disagree, which is fine because a lot of this is, again, it's very difficult material. Third Maccabees, which is in the Orthodox Bible, I've always felt is a good indicator and an insight into this domain, because Ptolemy is in that book one of the types of Antichrist, predecessor Antichrist figures who, as this sort of pagan beast type of ruler, institutes for the Jews an actual mark, which is it's like a leaf, and it's supposed to signify the mysteries of Dionysius. And if you're not initiated into the mysteries, in I think it's chapter 2 of Third Maccabees, you're not able to buy or sell, and you actually have to get a little tattoo of the mysteries of Dionysius at that time to be able to buy and sell. Now, that book is only in the Orthodox canon, and I've always felt like that was an insight into the possibility of how we might find indicators within the text to help understand what the mark of the beast is, which, if there is, and I think there will be, end times fulfillments, and for that element of the text, one of the Jordanville monastery text says that as the church progresses towards the end of the whenever the real end of the world is, the saints and the church will know. They will have a cognizance, and because they have the mind of Christ, they will know exactly how to interpret the finality sense of the text towards the end of the world.
Maybe patent number 666.
No, I'm not even going there. I'm just saying that there could be some attempt at that towards the end of the world, and I'm just looking at Third Maccabees, which I've never seen anybody look at Third Maccabees for another indicator of Antichrist. I think there will be a final Antichrist. I don't know how that'll play out, but if in the Jordanville text they say that I was trying to find it, I don't know where I put it, but they basically just give the reason I like that one is that they don't go into a lot of speculation. They basically just give about 4 or 5 things to expect towards the end of the world. That is the standard amongst a lot of the Orthodox Church fathers and saints. Here it is. And they say things like, if there is another temple, is one of the signs. The mass conversion of the Jews, which most of the church fathers do say is a future reality based on the text in Romans 11. I know that's a hotly debated passage, but I do think there is a prediction of a future conversion of the Jews. How that will happen, when that will happen, we don't know. But that's one of the signs that the Jordanville text mentions. And the only reason I'm bringing all this up is I'm curious, what in Jordan's analysis and your editing of this text is kind of the future final fulfillment stuff that we should take note of.
Yeah, all good insights, good comments, and a lot of things to say there. Let me start with the mark of the beast and the number of the beast. Yes, there could be a future thing where there's some kind of mark or number on the hand and forehead, don't know. But the way Jordan interprets it for Revelation, for the near fulfillment, which I think is very good, I like it, is that the number 666, there's only one other place in the Bible where the number 666 shows up.
It's Solomon in the, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Chapter 1 Kings 10 or something. But it's Solomon is going great in his life, and he's righteousness upon righteousness. And then it says he brought in 666 talents, which was 100 pounds of gold a year, into his kingdom. And then his life starts to go down, 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 down. And 3 things a king can't do: multiply wives, multiply horses, and multiply gold. And Solomon started doing all 3. And we know the story of Solomon, that the wives turned his heart. He ended up building temples to Molech and these other sex goddess temples and child sacrifice people. I mean, he went way, way, way down. So Jordan says that what 666 represents is the fullness of apostasy. So you can't really apostatize if you haven't converted first. But nobody had converted like Solomon. He was the wisest person who ever lived. And then he turned and became one of the most wicked people. And so he represents kind of this fullness of apostasy, 666. And so then Israel, in its fullness of wickedness, it represented the fullness of apostasy. And so 666 was really representative of that. But it doesn't mean that whoever evil people we see down the road, and may not be just one, and it may be several in the next millennia,
Right.
Won't have some sort of 666 association. God could do that. And one of the things Jordan harps on a lot, he says you do the near fulfillment, which is rock solid in terms of the symbolism,
Right.
conforming to the history, and then you take those patterns and you use them, pattern recognition, in what's going on in your life today. So, I don't take myself too seriously when I do that, but I do it. I was talking to some young kid the other day at church. We were talking about some of this stuff, and he wanted to know what I thought about 1,000 years and the millennium. Well, there's a pretty solid interpretation of that for Revelation. But I told him, I said, hey, look, the Byzantium Empire lasted about 1,000 years. It's the longest empire ever, and arguably the greatest empire ever, and it was extremely Christian. So to me, there's just no way that there's not an association of that with the 1,000 years that's talked about in Revelation. I don't think it's the primary fulfillment. I just think that there's probably some kind of association. And when there's a patent 666 that comes out for this evil stabby, sure, there's probably some kind of association. Am I going to talk about it publicly? Well, I am right now, but I would just always say this is just speculation and thought. But you gotta put it in your hip pocket and think about it.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of that stuff
really irrelevant.
is definitely spirit of Antichrist, as was Herod, Pharaoh, Herod. They were all of the spirit of Antichrist.
Yes.
Without being the final Antichrist in whatever form or fashion that takes. I did want to ask, let's see, I had another question that I down here for you. Oh, we got a super chat from Tenublet again, sends $5. Thank you both very much. Thank you so much there for those super chats. Guys, definitely, I think you want to get the book. And even if you don't come to agree, one thing I noticed looking through your text, and I think you kind of made this point to me when we were chatting about it, when I look at like Lightheart's text, it's very technical, and there's a place for that. I'm not denigrating the technical, textual scholar type stuff, but your readings and your approach seems to be a lot more down to earth, in the sense of like it's more accessible. It's more, I don't know what the right word I'm looking for is. It's not anti-intellectual, but it's not technical. How would you describe what you've done here?
Well, I appreciate all those descriptions. I work very, very hard to be a clear communicator, and I think that needs to be above all things. I use story structure. We talked about different genres and that kind of stuff. I use story structure to try to whet the appetite of the reader and move their interest along. So I think those things are all a high priority. I take a lot of effort in it, and it's very difficult. But what are we looking at there? I can't tell when I put it there. But yeah, I think clear communication is always a high priority, and I put a lot of effort into doing that.
Yeah, it was a liturgical image. You had a bishop sensing with a censer there, and you got imagery like the planets here. What's that about there with the planets?
Well, the 7 moving stars are representative of the 7 bowls in Revelation, and the 7 moving stars are a huge component of what the Gentiles used to understand the universe.
Right.
The 7 moving stars are the 7 planets, but they include the sun and the moon, and then the 5 planets.
I think that was the ancient world was that way. Like, if you go read,
Right.
if you read St. John Damascus on the Orthodox faith, he talks about, understanding this times and seasons via the houses of the zodiac and the 7 planets, the celestial spheres and all that. That was just the entire ancient world.
Yeah, we dig up 1st and 2nd century synagogues that have the zodiac on the floor. Yeah, that's just
well. And for those that don't know, it's pretty common. I know Chilton talks about this. I've read other commentaries. I think Gordon Wenham, his commentaries on Deuteronomy and Leviticus. The breastplate, right? The 12 jewels on the high priest breastplate are not just the tribes of Israel. It's also the houses of the zodiac. It had a dual symbology there.
Yes, and they all show up in the final city in Revelation. And there's a correspondence between the tribes and the zodiac. And I think there might be one other thing, but I can't remember what it is.
For those that are confused in the audience, no, this does not mean that you're giving yourself over to astrology. What it means is that the entire ancient world didn't divorce astronomy from the zodiac. And so the houses of the zodiac is just the way that the ancient world understood the passage of time and seasons. It has nothing to do with consigning yourself to fate and being an astrologer. The ancient world didn't think that way.
Yeah, I mean, the the whole Psalm 19 is about the sun passing through the zodiac.
Mazaroth is mentioned in the book of Job, I think. So yeah, should be people that know biblical imagery.
This whole thing of angels being replaced by humanity, which is the main theme of Revelation and the main theme of all of history. Stars are a metaphor for angels, or a symbol for angels.
They're all throughout the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms.
And so these stars get replaced by us. And so in the New Testament and the New Age and the New Covenant, just like the sun comes up and all the stars disappear, well, now in the New Covenant, all the sons of God have risen up, and we have the scriptures and all that kind of stuff. And so all that star stuff goes away. So this is an interesting thing. We don't follow the stars follow us.
Yeah, well said. Guys, you got to be sure and get a hold of Dean's book here. It's listed in the show description. We put it into the chat many times. If you click on over here to his personal website, Dean W. Arnold, you'll notice the links for the book there, as well as links to get the full audio. Maybe we can come back as I read through this. I definitely would like to get into more of the nitty gritty. We'll maybe do some more talks and interviews and podcasts on this. Storm the Cat sends $10 and says, "I love the cover art on the Revelation text. Anything that inspired you specifically to choose what you chose as the cover imagery?"
Well, I got a guy that I got off of a national website who's done some New York Times bestseller covers. He's just a great artist. He's not a believer, older guy, but man, he does some killer covers. I kind of knew I wanted a dragon, so we had to go through several things for a dragon, and we ended up using an icon of a dragon, so that was kind of helpful. But no, I just people have talent, and I was very glad to use him. I used him for my Ethiopia cover too, so I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah, somebody said, what are the wandering stars? Well, if you read the book of Jude and Peter, they talk about wandering stars as the heretics and the false teachers. So wandering stars are those that are perhaps presenting Christ or pretend to be of Christ, and then they wander off into heresies. Alula sends $5. Jay, hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving. Thank you for having Dean back on. I want to pick up this collection. I'm looking forward to Esoteric Hollywood 3 to get all your books at the same time. Well, guess what? Esoteric Hollywood 3 is called Sex, Cults, and Apocalypse in Film, where I'm going to I have an entire section about apocalypse films in Hollywood. Why? Because we are at the end of Hollywood. Hollywood, as it's been classically known, the studio system is dying away. Now there's, new versions of, Apple Studios, Amazon Studios. So movies aren't going away, but the old Hollywood system is pretty much dead. We've done interviews with famous Hollywood people about that, Jamie Kennedy and others. So actually my third book in the trilogy will tie in very well to Dean's trilogy, because I'm going to be talking quite a bit about the apocalyptic ending of Hollywood. So thank you for that. Now, Dean, we should do more podcasts. There's so much material here. Is there anything that you want to leave us with before we close out this excellent interview? And again, tell people why they ought to get your books.
Yeah, thanks. I'll end with this, and that is, I sort of feel like I was digging out in the backyard and got down about 6 feet below, and I came across this box and opened it up, and there was a scroll in it, and it's an ancient book that was written by an apostle that no one ever found. Of course, that's not what happened, but I feel like Revelation is this book that everybody looks at futuristically.
Right.
And it's not wrong to do that. It's usually done irresponsibly. But you can also deal with Revelation with near-term fulfillment, where you're doing sober analysis of the history of it and what happened in the first century and all the awesome fulfillments and all the things. And it's just this book that almost few people have read it. Those who have read it, usually their eyes glaze over and they haven't studied it, responsible people. So I feel like I've kind of found this book. I was like, hey, man, this thing's awesome. And it's in the Bible and you haven't really dealt with it yet. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I remember when you told me you were doing this 4 years ago, I was like, this is a brilliant idea. I'm so glad. Hopefully we can add sobriety to this domain, which very much lacks sobriety and responsibility, as Dean says. Now, I want to remind you guys that I do have a show sponsor, which is chalk.com, the best in supplementation. Head on over to chalk.com, CHOQ.com, and get a hold of that performance stack there that will help you in the gym. It will help you get in a fit state of mind. It would become toxically masculine. If you're not going into the monastery and you're going to live in this world, then this kind of stuff that we're talking about is necessary. You're going to need to learn how to make money, to run a family, run a business. You need to be fit. You need to be healthy. And Chalk is part of that by heading over to CHOQ.com. Use promo code J44Life. That's JAY44LIFE. And get access to those great products. Also, Dean has a lot of great articles that go back many years over on his website. Go check out the catalog of interviews that I've done with Dean over the years. He's got other great books, Old Money, New South. He's got books on Hillary and the corruption in terms of the Hillary Clinton domain. He's got the Unknown Empire text that he wrote 4 or 5 years ago that we've done interviews on, and many other books as well. So be sure and head on over to Dean W. Arnold, linked in the show description, and get access to those. You can also get my philosophy course, which is always available. Remember, you can always buy the philosophy course. The link is in the show description, the Autonomy Agora Marketplace. And I've been forgetting, but we have our great Orthodox coffee sponsors. That link is also in the show description for Lore Coffee. They've got all kinds of excellent blends. I have worked my way through about 4 of these bags, and I'm going to tell you, they're pretty stout. They're pretty strong. They've got, if you're looking for the Long Bridge, if you're looking for the Death to the World blend, they've got all kinds of excellent blends. They've even got a patristic faith blend over there if you want to support FDA and his work. That link is in the show description too. Dean, thank you so much. Come back very soon, and let's get deeper into this text.